She was put in a coffin while still awake. She survived 83 hours buried alive. It was mid-December 1968, December 16th, on a cold night outside Atlanta, at a roadside inn not far from Emory University. A young college student, sick with the Hong Kong flu, sat in a small motel room with her mother. What followed would become one of the most bizarre and carefully planned kidnappings in American crime history, and the story of how a young woman kept herself alive inside a fiberglass box until rescuers found her. If you like investigative deep dives into true crime, consider subscribing. Barbara Mackle was 21, a student at Emory. She had been laid low by the flu and had checked into a motel with her mother Jane while visiting family for the holidays. Her father, Robert Mackle, was a prominent land developer, someone who could and would be a target because of what he had. The setting was ordinary: a winter motel lobby, a couple of strangers, traffic on the nearby road. That ordinariness made what happened next feel all the more impossible. Just before dawn, a knock came on the door. Two men were at the threshold, one claiming to be a policeman, the other portraying an authority with a name pulled from thin air. They showed a fabricated report of an accident involving a friend. They spoke confidently, practiced. Jane opened the door. Within moments, the room became a scene of rapid, violent precision: ski masks, a shotgun, duct tape, a Venetian blind cord used to secure hands. The men moved with a plan and a purpose. Jane struggled. Barbara was taken. The abduction itself was quick and methodical. According to the facts of the case, the kidnappers had rehearsed the ruse and timed it for the depth of the night. They bound Jane and used the pretense of an urgent roadside emergency to remove Barbara before anyone could fully comprehend what had happened. The mother's efforts to resist, the muffled noise of taped mouths, the hurried shoving of a body into a car, those details anchor the brutality of the operation without dwelling on physical cruelty. It was about control, speed, and leaving as little trace as possible. What the kidnappers had prepared at a remote site in Gwinnett County was not a crude grave, but an engineered survival chamber. Buried in a stand of pines was a coffin-like capsule, a fiberglass-lined box measuring 6 feet long by 23 inches wide by 23 inches high, 183 by 58 by 58 centimeters. Inside, the kidnappers installed 2 ventilation pipes, a battery-powered lamp, a small chemical toilet, a supply of food and water, a typed set of instructions, and a camera to take a photograph. They tested elements of the setup beforehand. Before she was sealed in, Barbara was injected with a tranquilizer and given a cup of water that was later revealed to be lightly sedative-laced. She was photographed inside, instructed to "smile for Daddy," and then the lid was screwed down. They shoveled roughly 1.5 feet of soil over the box and drove away. For anyone trying to imagine the experience, the figures themselves are a kind of shorthand for claustrophobia. 6 feet in length allowed a person to lie down, but 23 inches across left little room to turn. 2 vents threaded through the lid ensured some exchange of air, but they also sealed the space into a political question of survival. How much did the kidnappers intend to allow? The typed instructions, the battery lamp, the food, all of it announced a perverse respect for life's mechanics, while exercising total power over another human being. Inside the capsule, time became a different thing. When the narrative shifts into Barbara's perspective, the account tightens, present tense taking over to convey the immediacy of each minute. She lies on a thin mattress. The lamp casts a small pool of light against fiberglass walls. The typed instructions lie within reach. A chemical toilet sits near her feet. She tastes the sedative faintly in the water. Outside, the muffled thump of shovels moves closer and then recedes. The lid is screwed tight. Soil falls above her, the muffled sound of earth that can never be unheard once you have listened to it from below. Suffocating images are easy to imagine. Screams, panic, the body's betraying noises. What kept her alive, the transcripts and her own account tell us, was less drama than discipline. She followed the directions placed there by her captors. She rationed the water and the food. She controlled her breathing to slow her physical need. She sang hymns. She imagined Christmas, the lights, the tree, a childhood memory that pulled the present into a softer shape. She forced attention onto small tasks, a mental tally, the feel of the lamp's warmth. Because attention is a kind of oxygen, her survival was not only mental. The box had been built with specific survival features: 2 air pipes, a battery lamp, a chemical toilet. The kidnappers left a supply of food and water, but there were also elements of betrayal in the care. The water had been dosed with a sedative. Outside, the kidnappers claimed they would check on her. They set a ransom demand, a staggering $500,000, and began to stage the extortion. The ransom letter itself was planted in a place calculated to hit home, buried in the Mackle family garden inside a glass tube. The note demanded $500,000 and outlined pickup plans. What followed were a series of drop attempts, staked rendezvous, and mistakes that would become crucial to the investigation. One of the kidnappers made a fatal error. They abandoned a car that contained photographs, registration, and other documents. That car became a key pivot point. Photographs and paperwork in the vehicle, inspected by local police and eventually the FBI, tied the plan to a name previously known to law enforcement. Fingerprints recovered from the abandoned car matched a man bearing an alias, George Deacon, but his real name was Gary Stephen Christ. That match would lead investigators down a trail that connected the plan to persons with the means and motive to attempt such a crime. At the same time, other threads of evidence began to appear. A piece of paperwork from a trailer involved in the scheme turned up in the hands of a buyer who came forward. His tip helped narrow the search. University ties emerged, people connected to Emory and to local student circles who had crossed paths in varying degrees with the accused. Every small document, every fingerprint, every registration plate pushed investigators forward like a ratchet tightening the world around the perpetrators. The FBI joined the case quickly. Their work was methodical, analyzing fingerprints, tracing vehicle registrations, comparing photographs, following up on tips from strangers who had noticed odd details. Agents assembled a picture of an operation that had been thought out in advance, an engineered box, a script of deception, and yet had relied on human fallibility. The abandoned car was the error that turned confidence into traceability. Meanwhile, the family followed the kidnappers' demands as directed. Ransom drops were tried and failed in different ways. Poorly timed handoffs, men shadowing would-be collectors, money transferred, and then ambushed. At one point, law enforcement moved to intercept the exchanges. The kidnappers attempted to control the narrative by giving vague directions, by telling parts of the truth, by pushing the family into compliance. But with each failed drop, with each miscalculation, the net around them tightened. The search for the burial site was exhaustive and often frustrating. Agents combed the Gwinnett County woods, feeling for differences in the soil and for signs that someone had recently been there. The color of the peat and the red Georgia clay became evidence to the trained eye. On the third day, after more than 70 hours underground, an imprecise phone direction from the primary kidnapper finally guided officers to a general area. There, a small patch of disturbed soil, lighter, redder, out of place against the desaturated winter ground, caught an investigator's attention. They began to dig. At first, shovelfuls of earth came up slow and cautious, as if the rescuers themselves feared that the wrong motion might seal or shatter a chance at life. The ground gave way to a hard surface, fiberglass, then the lid. They unfastened the screws. For all the engineering that had gone into that box, the speed of a spade and the determination of men above ground determined the difference between burial and rescue. When the lid opened, the world of light and wind and cold air rushed in. Barbara, dehydrated and weak but still conscious, emerged. The first remark she made, laced with a kind of brittle humor that would be replayed again and again in newspapers and on television, was a humanizing line delivered without artifice. "You are the handsomest men I have ever seen." That sentence, short and oddly disarming, did more than lighten the moment. It announced the core of the story. She was alive, and she was still a person who could make a quip in the midst of trauma. Medical personnel tended to her at once. She was dehydrated and fragile, suffering from the effects of sedatives and from limited fluid and food intake, but she was able to speak and to describe some of what had happened. The lamp, the vents, the toilet, each item had done what the kidnappers had intended, kept a human body alive inside a confined space long enough for rescue to be possible, assuming investigators found the correct spot. The public reaction was immediate. Newspapers seized on the extraordinary detail. A young woman buried alive in a box and rescued by the FBI. The case raised questions about wealth and vulnerability, about the limits of planning, and about the thin margins that stand between life and death. For the Mackle family, it was personal trauma played out on a national stage. Law enforcement proceeded to arrest and charge suspects. Ruth Eiserman Shear, an accomplice, was arrested later after fingerprints and a trail of paperwork connected her to the operation. Gary Stephen Christ, the man who had used the alias and whose fingerprints matched material from the abandoned car, was identified as a principal in the plot. Both were tried, convicted, and sentenced, though the story of justice did not end simply with those convictions. Subsequent developments complicated the sense of closure. Paroles, appeals, and public debates about punishment and rehabilitation entered the record as the decades wore on. What is undisputed in the official record is that the perpetrators were brought to account in court, convicted of the crimes they had committed, and given prison terms commensurate with the severity of the kidnapping. Barbara's own life remarkably continued. She recovered physically and, in time, emotionally. She published a memoir, 83 Hours Till Dawn, recording the facts of those days and how she had managed to endure. The book is both a personal testimony and a document that has helped preserve the details of the case for legal records and for historians. In interviews and in print, she emphasized routine, ritual, and small acts of will. Hymns sung quietly, memories of family gatherings, the practice of controlling breath and gaze. Those were the techniques that shaped her interior survival. Looking at the case from a distance, several themes stand out. First, planning versus luck. The kidnappers had planned with chilling precision. They designed a capsule that could, in technical terms, sustain life. They plotted ransom logistics and practiced deception. Yet their plan relied on human choices that could and did go wrong. An abandoned car, a buyer who kept a scrap of paperwork, a fingerprint left in haste, an imprecise voice on the phone. Each mistake created a trail. Investigative work turned those trails into leads. The FBI's methodical tracing of fingerprints and paperwork demonstrates how investigative patience can work against carefully constructed crime. Second, the thinness of the margin between life and death. The presence of ventilation pipes, a lamp, a chemical toilet, and sedative-laced water created a complicated calculus. The sedative reduced panic and metabolic demand, but it also obscured responses that might have led to escape. The box could have been a tomb, or, because of those same elements, an improbable refuge. Barbara's survival hinged on a combination of the kidnappers' cold engineering, her own psychological resilience, and the investigators' chance-laden successes. Third, the aftermath and the limits of closure. Convictions were secured. The family and the public watched legal processes unfold. Yet legal resolution did not erase the trauma, nor did it answer all questions about motive and later behavior. The case remained a study in how crime can be both meticulously planned and recklessly imperfect. The rescue itself was cinematic without being theatrical. The slow, careful unearthing, the rush of air and light, the human voices on top of the wooden lid translating into hands that helped pull a body into the open. The story's climax is not a single moment of heroism, but a confluence of acts: investigative persistence, a tipster's memory, an abandoned car full of evidence, the presence of ventilation inside the capsule, and a woman's will to live. In the days and years afterward, the case became a cautionary tale and a subject of public fascination. It produced a book, dozens of newspaper stories, and a law enforcement case study. For Barbara, there was the personal task of reclaiming ordinary life, finishing school, reconnecting with family, and finding ways to live in a world that had once compressed to the size of a box. For the investigators, there was the lesson of detail. Never dismiss the small scrap of paper, the anonymous tip, the registration plate, the fingerprint. There are practical specifics that anchor the episode in verifiable fact. The kidnapping occurred between December 16th and December 20th, 1968. The burial site was in Gwinnett County near Lawrenceville, Georgia. The capsule's dimensions, 183 by 58 by 58 centimeters, are part of the official record, as are the items left inside: a battery lamp, a chemical toilet, food, water, 2 ventilation pipes, and typed instructions. The ransom demand of $500,000 was placed, and the family was instructed to comply with the kidnappers' transaction plan. The ransom letter was planted and found buried in a glass tube beneath the Mackle family garden. Investigative breakthroughs included the abandoned car with photographs and registration leading to fingerprint comparisons, a tip from the buyer of a trailer who retained paperwork, and an imprecise phone direction from one of the kidnappers that eventually focused searchers on a patch of disturbed red soil. Barbara survived, conscious but dehydrated and weak, when agents opened the capsule after more than 3 days underground. The public was both repelled and riveted by the details, enough to keep attention on court dates and to demand answers about motive and culpability. The trials resulted in convictions and sentences for the principal perpetrators. Over time, some aspects of the legal aftermath and later events complicated the family's sense of finality, and the case remains a cautionary example of how criminal acts intersect with legal systems and public memory. This story is often framed as an extraordinary survival against impossible odds, but it is also, more quietly, a story about the small acts that sustain life. The choice to sing a hymn, the insistence on keeping one thought anchored, Christmas lights, a child's memory, and the discipline to count, breathe, to conserve. Barbara's memoir and later interviews highlight the mundane techniques that can become heroic by virtue of context. They remind us that resilience is not always a dramatic act. It can be a series of small, deliberate choices. There are also institutional lessons. The FBI's role, combined with local police work, shows how different strands of evidence, ballistics, fingerprints, paper trails, eyewitnesses, come together. The case underlined the importance of follow-up on seemingly trivial leads: a man who purchased a trailer, a registration left in an automobile, a scrap of a photograph, a single fingerprint. Investigation is often a mosaic of small pieces that only form a picture when assembled. For the Mackle family, the events changed how they navigated public life. For Barbara, they shaped a narrative she would later tell in 83 Hours Till Dawn. Her book provides first-hand testimony of the interior hours beneath the soil and the exterior hours of family anguish and investigative labor above ground. For historians and true crime students, the case remains instructive. It is not only about a sensational method of kidnapping, but about how criminal ingenuity collides with human error and institutional process. When the story is distilled down to its elemental question, how did she survive? The answer is layered. The box had been built with the mechanics of survival in mind. The kidnappers left tools that could maintain life. The kidnappers also made mistakes that exposed them to detection. Investigators did their work, following the paper and the prints. And Barbara, inside a narrow space, exercised mental discipline: hymns, memories of Christmas, following instructions. Those factors combined so that when the spades broke through the soil, they did not bring up a corpse but a living person. There is a particular kind of quiet in the hours after rescue. Cameras and microphones swarm, but close to the center of things, there is only the slow reintroduction of someone into air and light. The first words, the small joke about the rescuer's handsomeness, became a humanizing counterpoint to the technicalities of the case. It was a line that testified not to frivolity, but to presence, a way of signaling under duress that she was still herself. The legal consequences that followed are part of the historical record: arrests, trials, convictions, and prison sentences. Those outcomes did not erase the trauma or resolve every question about motive or consequence. Later developments, appeals, and debates over punishment meant that closure was partial, as is often the case in such high-profile crimes. If there is a single lesson at the end of this story, it is not about heroism in the abstract, but about the narrow margin that separates subsistence from catastrophe. A piece of plastic piping, a battery lamp, a scrap of paper, all the mundane things, were configured to hold life for a time. And one human being's quiet determination, singing hymns, imagining a family holiday, counting breaths, kept a pulse steady until hands above ground could find the place where soil met fiberglass. Barbara Mackle lived to tell the tale. Her memoir preserves the facts and the feelings of those hours. The kidnapping remains an object of study, for law enforcement professionals tracking procedural errors, for criminologists thinking about the planning of abductions, and for readers drawn to stories of survival. The narrative specifies clear dates, places, and measurements, details that anchor an almost unbelievable story in certifiable fact. For more on this case, Barbara's book 83 Hours Till Dawn and various FBI case files and contemporary newspaper reports provide primary documentation and fuller context. If this deep dive into a single case interested you, consider liking and subscribing for more investigative true crime stories.